most important role of any established government has always been to protect the people. Whether this is from an outside threat or one that comes from within its own borders, the actions the government is willing to take speaks volumes of the ruling party in question and can vary from purely altruistic to downright dubious. Welcome to Lucid Trigger TV, and today we're going to be discussing 9 terrible things your government has done to you, the people. Number 9. Poisoning alcohol during Prohibition. During the Prohibition era, bootleg alcohol was largely produced by distilling industrial alcohols. As early as 1906, the government had required companies to denature industrial alcohol, but during Prohibition, it ordered toxic chemicals to be added as further deterrent. High demand for alcohol, accompanied by a thriving black market, meant the sale and consumption of now toxic bootleg liquors. The Christmas after the program went into effect, 100 people died. Stories were run in local newspapers warning of the risk, but the people wouldn't be deterred. In the following years, a minimum of 10,000 people died from poisoned alcohol, and the stories rarely leave the headlines. While it should be noted that government officials never directly poisoned any alcohol, they were aware of the impact their actions had and could have stopped the program at any point. Number 8. Funneling cocaine into the inner cities. In the early 1980s, the Cold War was going strong. The Russians sought to establish more communist governments throughout the world, and the US aimed to stop them. Enter Nicaragua and the anti-communist Contras. President Reagan had run for election on the campaign promise of assisting anti-communist insurgencies around the world, and the Contras definitely fit the bill as they were battling against the communist Sandinistas that had seized power of the country in 1979. Reagan was fond of the Contras, going as far as to call them the moral equivalent to the Founding Fathers. But, much of their funding came from the cocaine trade. Because of this, in fact, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which blocked the United States from funding the group. This didn't stop Reagan, who told his national security advisor Robert McFarland to help the Contras anyway, regardless of the cost. Getting around the congressional hurdles meant that, in order to finance the rebellion, the CIA would work with the Nicaraguan nationals to funnel cocaine into Los Angeles. A drug that was once virtually unattainable in black neighborhoods would soon lead to an epidemic. Number 7. The War on Drugs.
People have to realize that most of our history we didn't have federal laws against the use of drugs.
Currently, the United States locks people up at a rate worse than any other country in the world. Nearly 2 times as much as Russia, and almost 6 times as much as China. In fact, while the United States is less than 5% of the world's population, it accounts for nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. This, despite the fact that, if you were to look at all relevant FBI statistics, crime is at a historic low. How can this be, you ask? Well, it is due in large part to Ronald Reagan's war on drugs in the 1980s. In addition to trickle-down economics, the slashing of corporate tax rates, and the Iran-Contra scandal, the Gipper gave us mandatory minimum prison sentences for non-violent drug offenses. Due to this, the prison population would climb from 500,000 people in 1980 to 2.3 million people in 2008. Sadly, the increase in both arrests as well as the length of prison sentence disproportionately affected the black community, due in large part to an influx of crack cocaine into their neighborhoods. Number 6. MKUltra. From its dubious origins in the 1950s to the end of the program in the early 1960s, MKUltra is a prime example of what government with no oversight is capable of. Essentially a continuation of work that began in Nazi concentration camps, MKUltra was a series of secret experiments that were intended to develop drugs and procedures with the explicit goal of weaponized mind control. You see, during the early period of the Cold War, the CIA had become convinced that the communists had discovered just such a technique, so they had to have one of their own. What this meant was the secret testing of said drugs and procedures on unwitting soldiers, prisoners, and even citizens. In one particularly troubling incident, a test subject was recruited, told that he was part of an experiment aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia, only to be given LSD every day for a year because the government actually wanted to know the long-term effect of acid. MKUltra ended in the early 1960s, but we'll never truly know how many lives were affected. Most of the papers were burned, and what we actually know of the program comes about from the comparatively small amount of evidence that survived. Ironically, one of the lasting outcomes of MKUltra was that the CIA ended up bringing a drug to America that would fuel a generational movement centered on tearing down everything they hold dear. Number 5. Radiation poisoning from nuclear tests. In 1949, rival Soviet Union detonated its first ever atomic bomb. Shocked by this revelation, the United States moved the majority of its nuclear testing from the South Pacific to the Nevada test site, where they could be conducted in more rapid succession. It was understood that there would be some risk posed to nearby civilians, but this was deemed as acceptable. An unforeseen consequence of this was the death of up to 700,000 American civilians from 1951 to 1973. These deaths occurred predominantly in the Midwest, with the majority of them coming not from direct contact with nuclear fallout, but from consuming contaminated milk. To put this number in comparison, the Chernobyl disaster killed around 27,000 people. In all, a total of 921 nuclear detonations have occurred at the Nevada test site. Number 4. The secret and intentional testing of radiation on civilians. In conjunction with the Manhattan Project of the early 1940s, the United States government knowingly exposed citizens to radioactive materials in order to study their effect. Throughout federally funded studies, a total of 18 people were injected with plutonium, more than 800 women were given vitamins that contained radioactive iron, and 73 disabled Massachusetts schoolchildren were given radioactive oatmeal. Bodies were dug up and tested after some of the patients had died, but it was even worse for the living. One man, who was never told why, had bone tissue removed in addition to 15 teeth, all taken for plutonium sampling. It wasn't until the 1970s when survivors had been informed of what had been done to them, and it was even longer before any received financial compensation. Number 3. Torture testing. From 1964 to 1968, the U.S. Army paid nearly $400,000 to professors Albert Kligman and Herbert Copeland to perform experiments on inmates at Philadelphia's Holmesburg prison. In one of the studies, dioxin, a highly toxic carcinogenic compound found in Agent Orange, was injected into 70 unwitting subjects. Severe lesions formed and went untreated for up to 7 months as the professors recorded their findings, so that we could better treat the workers who got sick manufacturing Agent Orange for the Vietnam War. In another of the secretly funded studies, the professors forcibly dosed 320 inmates with mind-bending hallucinogens in order to determine the minimum effective dose that would be needed to incapacitate 50% of any given population. Eventually, a book would be written by a disapproving prison worker. A wave of national attention was stirred, and a congressional hearing brought these particular tests to an end. Number 2. Forced sterilizations. Initially, sterilization programs targeted disabled white men who were deemed unfit to breed, but as the 1920s approached, programs shifted and just as many women became affected. New theories in the field of biology and genetics began to be applied to human breeding. Wealthy elites with strong biases about who is fit or unfit embraced eugenics, thinking that the whole of society could be improved by selective breeding. Blacks, indigenous people, poor whites, and people with disabilities, anyone that did not fit into the ruling class's mold of racial perfection, became targeted for forced sterilization. All told, up to 70,000 people were forcibly sterilized between the years of 1907 and 1963, with the most affected group being black women, who became disproportionately targeted during the desegregation movement of the 1950s and 60s. Tragically, the practice has yet to entirely die out in the U.S. Between 1997 and 2014, up to 1,000 women in the California prison system were sterilized against their will. And now, as of late 2020, there have been new allegations of immigrant detainees being coerced or straight up forced into sterilization. Number 1. The Tuskegee Experiment. Beginning in 1932 and lasting for nearly 40 years, the Tuskegee Experiment's stated purpose was to observe the effects of untreated syphilis. Hundreds of poor African-American men were recruited and told that they were being treated for bad blood, only to receive no treatment at all. Instead, they were studied as they slowly went blind, insane, or died. 15 years into the study, it was discovered that penicillin was the best treatment for the disease, but none of the men received it. This at a time when 28 participants had already perished directly from the disease, and another 100 from related complications. In spite of this, senior officials in charge decided to continue, with the goal of tracking all participants until death, when autopsies could be performed and data could be fully realized. Eventually, nearly 40 years into the study, it finally came to an end, when a leak to the press caused a public outcry. Congressional hearings were held, and an out-of-court settlement was reached. There you have it. 9 terrible things your government has done to you. Was there something we missed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, the more secrecy we allow our government to requisition, the less rights we have as a people. Demand more transparency and oversight. And ask yourself, what could the government be doing right now that they prefer we don't know about?